Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bible study for the 24th of February of 2021. My name is James Merriam, and I am one of the ministers at the United Church of Newport, and so it is my privilege to welcome you to this time of reflection and study and devotion of a piece of scripture and of text and of our common lineage and, common sacred texts that we otherwise would not really have the opportunity to join together in reflection about. The lectionary gives us a huge amount of text each week so that in the 3-year cycle we can cover it's more than 2/3 of all of Scripture, which is a staggering accomplishment out of the enormous book with the enormous amount of interpretation, the enormous amount of scholarship, the enormous amount of potential for inspiration that there is. And really, it's a discipline. It's a worthy thing during Lent. More than anything else, to not run away from difficult texts, and not just turn back to the same texts of reassurance time after time. Perhaps that's an appropriate discipline for many, since as the expression goes for our present era, but is not new to our present era, to have a mouthful of scripture but a heart full of hate is no kind of way to live a Christian life. So we're going to do that. We're going to go into a passage that's included in the lectionary for this coming week, a passage that we're not going to be focusing on Sunday, but a passage that actually also cuts out in the lectionary as it's given. It only does 2 sections within the passage, leaving out a big middle section. So I'm going to include that middle section, and I'm going to include a little bit beyond the end of this passage. To some extent, because we have that luxury, because we have this time, we have some quality reflection on and some scholarship, and some just like not only that, but the connection of the scholarship with the real world. Because you can go really deep, you can go really, really deep into analyzing and dividing and parsing the scripture in Hebrew. You can parse the scripture in English if you want, though, depending on your version of the text. You mostly tie yourself in knots that way. Or you can sort of seek the greater trend, the greater threads. We try to do really both. We try to do both very much, to neither neglect the scholarship, which is where all of our knowledge comes from, nor to be bogged down in the particulars too significantly. Of course, after this after this Bible study at 6 o'clock will be the rebroadcast of last Sunday's first Sunday of Lent, which is I was very a service that I've wanted to do for a long time, which is to some extent a celebration of winter and snow and skiing, one of my favorite things. So do join us for that if you have not already, and of course that's available anytime on YouTube, as of course is this Bible study. And this coming Sunday, of course, will be the second Sunday of Lent. We have some wonderful music prepared for you. That's 9 o'clock Sunday morning, and again next week at 6 o'clock on Wednesday. So the cycle of the days, the cycle of Scripture, just the opportunity to be together. We're going to be reading from Genesis, from chapter 17, and I have Robert Alter's most contemporary version of the Hebrew Scripture, which is in 3 volumes. The smallest of those volumes is the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Scripture, the books of Moses, as they have been called for a long time, or the Torah, as they are known, the law in the Jewish tradition. And we are in a section early on in Genesis, especially, where we're going to be talking about Abraham, and we're going to be talking about his name, of course. It's that section. So there is a lot to be said about this, since Abraham is the common ancestor of the three of the largest religions in the world. The 3 Abrahamic religions trace their lineage and their descendants to him spiritually and genetically. And so there's a lot to be said, a lot of detail, a lot of endnotes included. There's a lot of commentary, and people have read a lot of different things into this text. And they've read a lot of things that are convenient to their own time, talking about their own time, rather than really talking about Abraham's time, or talking about what this scripture can inform and inspire us to do from a spiritual direction. So this is Genesis chapter 17. We're going to start at the beginning. We're going to go through, to verse 17. And Abram was 99 years old, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk in my presence and be blameless, and I will grant my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you very greatly. And Abram flung himself on his face, and God spoke to him, saying, As for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be father to a multitude of nations, and no longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you father to a multitude of nations, and I will make you most abundantly fruitful and turn you into nations, and kings shall come forth from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you through generations as an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your seed after you. And I will give unto you and your seed after you the land in which you sojourn, the whole land of Canaan, as an everlasting holding, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my commandment, and you and your seed after you through their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and your seed after you. Every male among you must be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. 8 days old, every male among you shall be circumcised through your generations. Every slave born in the household, and those purchased with silver from any foreigner who is not of your seed. Those born in your household and those purchased with silver must be circumcised. And my covenant in your flesh shall be an everlasting covenant. And a male with a foreskin who is not circumcised, the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his folk. My covenant he has broken. And God said to Abraham, Sarai, your wife, shall no longer call her name Sarai, for Sarah is her name. And I will bless her, and I will also give you from her a son, and I will bless him, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall issue from her. And Abraham flung himself on his face and laughed, saying to himself, To 100-year-old will a child be born? Will 90-year-old Sarah give birth? And Abraham said to God, Would that Ishmael might live in your favor. And God said, Yet Sarah your wife is to bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his seed after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Look, I will bless him and make him fruitful and multiply him most abundantly. 12 chieftains he shall beget, and I will make him a great nation. And we really continue after that, and it flows and continues. So it's difficult to break off at one moment, simply because it is a flowing text. It is a text that is written and meant to be sung, really. That's why the tradition, of course, in reading Torah is that it's sung. It's a flowing. It repeats. It's almost going back to the same like refrain, and then including a verse. So, of course, you can probably tell what verses in there or what sections generally were included in the lectionary, and what the big section in the middle that was cut out that seems to sort of muddle and confuse and strike us and make us pay attention, make us give more attention to a section in the middle. That yes, the lectionary this week suggests reading the section about the new name for Abraham and the new name for Sarah, or that those two names are their names, the names that we remember them as, that they will no longer be Abram and Sarai, but instead they will be Abraham and Sarah. And what's maybe most striking about that is that those names are not really different. They don't have different Hebrew meanings. They're not really different names. It's just sort of like as the names, it really just reflects the evolution of those names within the Hebrew language, which sort of makes it's a little bit muddled as to whether this was sort of like that they both had old-fashioned names at that point, and this was just an update of their names. But the point that really comes through, the point that is really the focus of this, is that this is a new covenant, this is a new start, this is a new beginning, even at these very advanced ages that these two have come to. This is, they are being they're taking new names to represent a new era, and they will be remembered by the new names rather than the old. That this is a covenant that starts at this point between God, between El Shaddai, which is something like the Lord. Is more of a title than a name. In the Torah, you have really two names for God: El Shaddai and Yahweh. And Yahweh is a name, is like a familiar name, and El Shaddai is like a title. Of course, in usage, they sort of flipped in that regard, and El Shaddai almost becomes more affectionate, and Yahweh is more profound and more divine because the name of God is such a big deal, and that's why we end up with this four letter, just the four consonants in Yahweh as this profound symbol of God. But you're having this more sort of affectionate, familiar conversation between Abraham and God, who says, "Walk in my presence and be blameless." And what we have there is not a usage and a sort of a relationship that's not really familiar to us today. It's that Abraham is from this time forward to be sort of going in his own way, but also like taking the law and guidance of God to lead his own life rather than taking God's direct direction. So follow commandments, take the spirit of what the spirit in the sort of philosophical sense rather than in the religious sense. Take the essence and the guidance and make your own decisions rather than taking specific directions. Start over from now, that from now your relationship begins. This new relationship, this new covenant, this really second great covenant, and really in a colossal and very wide covenant, not quite as wide as the covenant that was with Noah a few chapters earlier, which is with all humankind. This covenant is narrowing somewhat to Abraham and his family and the many who will descend from him, which at this point is a staggering idea, that there will be many descendants, because Abraham has only one son and he's illegitimate. He's not it's Ishmael, the son of Hagar, Sarah's handmaid, a lesser son in effect. So here's the promise that there will be a second son, that there will be a son of Sarah and Abraham, even at this advanced age, itself an absolute miracle. You also have the renaming of Abraham and the renaming of Sarah, which are separated by this big chunk of text talking about something else. This short little section about Sarah, this longer section about Abraham at the beginning, which are put together as if they were just one continuous thing in the lectionary. But in between, you have this long section about circumcision. And this is really where circumcision enters the conversation, that it enters the conversation here, and it never leaves. In the history of all the Abrahamic faiths in Christianity, it's been controversial, it's been difficult, it's been challenging, it's been complicated, really from the very beginning right up to the present day. There's great debate over circumcision in other parts of the world. There's actually great debate about circumcision here. Every single nurse, it would seem, in the maternity ward at the hospital was like, okay, skipping over the circumcision section because my wife and I had a little girl a few weeks ago. Because it's a difficult question and a difficult challenge, and comes we're beginning in this section. This is where it's introduced, and it never goes away or gets any easier. But there are a few things that we can specifically take from the scripture. First off, that circumcision is not invented in this section. Circumcision is repurposed from other cultures, and from cultures that Abraham would have been familiar with, because Abraham was from Mesopotamia. Abraham had come into what is now Israel from what is now Iraq. And in Iraq, circumcision was a was a puberty ritual, was something you did as a young adult, basically more like priests or high-ranking officials in what is now Iraq and what is now Egypt. That was where circumcision was, and it was a mark of a higher elect status within society that you had achieved after passing through puberty. Instead, here we have this staggering suggestion that a person is part of this relationship with God just by virtue of their birth. So 8 days after birth, basically to get through the sad fact that in these days there was a huge amount of infant mortality, that if a child survived the first 8 days, to some extent they were very well out of the woods in a bunch of senses. There wasn't a child that could survive that long was ready to be named, was ready to be welcomed into the community. There was not the significant chance, not nearly so significant a chance that child would die unexpectedly or suddenly after those 8 days. So this is as soon as is reasonable, basically. You shall circumcise and mark this person forever as being one of yours, come what may. This is something that cannot be undone. This is something that cannot be hidden. This is an irrefutable and unignorable and undeniable mark of this covenant with God. And it's for you, and it's for your little tiny baby children, and it's for your ancestors. And not only that, it's for everyone in every stage of society. The leaders, the lesser men, even down to the slaves, even down to the lowest in society. Every single one of them is part of this covenant, part of this relationship in exactly the same way. There's no higher or lower degree of circumcision. There's no greater or lesser covenant. Every single person has this relationship. And to some extent, we see that later when that second-class son, Ishmael, is promised the same kind of covenant and nation and relationship that this first-class, yet-to-come son, Isaac, receives. So, of course, it's that this relationship is for everyone. Everyone should participate in the relationship with God through circumcision, this mark that's undeniable, this mark on this important part of the body that's undeniable, this mark that has meant divine, like a divine relationship, has meant an exalted status, this exalted status that is recognizable the world over at this point already. This is for everyone in your community. Everyone. So it's again repurposing an existing relationship, an existing symbol, an existing name, changing it just a little bit, but maintaining the essential meaning, which is the closeness of the relationship. Abraham and Abram, those two names don't mean anything different. To some extent, it's a little bit fancier of a name. It's a little bit more modern of a name. The same with Sarai and Sarah. It's a little bit more modern. And this is a new and more modern meaning for circumcision, of marking yourselves, the men, and their relationship and the extent to which they belong to God. It's humbling, really, being exalted through your humility is a theme that continues all the way through and is one of the core themes of Jesus Christ. And the Gospel of Luke, which is the Gospel of Matthew, which is the gospel that's most concerned with the continuation of the rituals and tradition of Hebrew Scripture, of course, includes that after 8 days, this is exactly what happened, and that Jesus, the very, very human and very Jewish Jesus that we see in the Gospel of Matthew, followed through in these traditions. Now, right at the end of this passage, and with a few verses that are not included in the lectionary text, it's just talking about names, really. We have Abraham flinging himself on his face and laughing and saying to himself how absurd it is that he and Sarah are to have a child. Now, of course, Abraham already flung himself on his face just before, and God was only speaking in between. So we can imagine Abraham sort of like prostrate and bowing before God, and then just like actually losing it because he's laughing. It's really very strange, and it was very strange then. It's hard to sort of understand in Hebrew, but it emerges and is sort of the text as it's written there gets sort of played with as the voyage of the patriarchs continues, as Isaac takes over from Abraham, and then as Jacob takes over from Isaac, with all the steps and missteps along the way. Laughter will be a big role. Now we sort of celebrate, and I've actually been to quite a few services that have focused on Sarah's laughter when God tells that this is what's going to happen, and God actually rebukes Sarah for her laughter, for throwing scorn on, or from sort of the perceived scorn that throws on the ability of God to do these things. And we hear that God definitely does not rebuke Abraham for this, but instead Abraham is maybe frustrated, or just the absurdity of the situation. He jumps to what comes first to his mind, which is the son he already has. What of Ishmael? And God gives immediate assurance of what is to happen to Ishmael. Yet at the same time, he says that there's going to be this son from whom to whom this covenant will primarily descend and continue with. That his name is to be Isaac, and that name is Yitzhak, in modern Hebrew, and that does actually mean and he laughed. It's the laughter. It's all the emotions in one right there, which is perhaps appropriate also for all the emotions that have gone through the story of Abraham up to this point, to realize that he is going to have this legacy, something that was never promised before, something that was never for sure before, something that was just sort of an out there possibility. So what we have is actually, the lectionary suggests just putting those two instances together, but what we have is 4 instances in a row: Abraham, circumcision, Sarah, and then Isaac, of symbols and signs that have very significant meaning in that ancient world, in Abraham's own time, and how God is giving them new and greater and more joyful and more wonderful and especially more inclusive meanings going forward. So this is hard and weird scripture to read, and there's good reason that a lot of the time we don't get into the weeds, don't try to get all muddled in the intervening sections, and we just focus on the names, because names are important, names are familiar, and really every one of us has there's a story behind our name. A story that's maybe inspiring, a story that can occasionally be frustrating, but a story that tells us about where we came from and who we are. And I'm sure someday soon I'll get the opportunity to tell more of the story. Well, it was actually part of my ordination process, part of my ordination exam, my ecclesiastical council a few weeks ago, was the discovery and then the inclusion as part of the meaning of my daughter's name, of where my family came from, who we are, and the conflicts that have arisen in the past, and how we've overcome them with greater joy. But that is a story for another day. Another day I hope will come soon. I hope that we will be able to celebrate perhaps the joyful occasions of springtime in the church together. And I hope that in not too distant future we'll be able to gather for a great and celebratory baptism of our little girl. And I've turned a little bit less towards scripture and a little more towards the personal. But that's wonderful. That's what scripture can evoke in us. So God bless wherever you are and whoever you are. You are welcome in our community of the faithful. You are welcome to share our joys and to bring your sorrows. For we mourn together just as we rejoice together. And as this pandemic, we hope, comes to an end, let us not give up our devotion or let down our guard or our attention in these last days. But stay safe, do good work, keep in touch, and we will see you again soon.